All right, you've already seen me in a couple of videos documenting my recent trip down memory lane. We're talking way down memory lane, several zip codes in terms of decades down memory lane. And in one of them I talked about the first sword I ever bought for myself. An India-made cavalry saber that was all kinds of bad, but I still loved it. And if HEMA was available to me at the time, well, I'd like to think I would have learned how to use it properly. But that's not what happened. A few years later, I got myself involved in formal Japanese and then Chinese martial arts training, which included swordsmanship, and left all of those European-style sword-shaped objects I'd acquired in my misspent youth behind to be forgotten until 2020, where if you leave me mostly in a room with minimal human contact and a lot of access to the internet for a year, well, actually officially more than a year now, thanks, apparently I'll start to have thoughts. And some of those thoughts have been nostalgic, and you've already seen me acquire a couple of modern reproductions, equivalents of those swords I loved back then that I never learned how to use, thinking maybe this old man might be able to learn some new styles of swordsmanship and not break himself further. And in the meantime, maybe apply some of the things I know about Japanese and Chinese swordsmanship to those weapons. And yes, there are a lot of similarities and a whole lot of differences. And here I am thinking this is probably going to be a video series. I think it needs to be. At least you can watch me struggle learning some new stuff and maybe or maybe not breaking myself. But until then, let's talk about the second sword I ever bought for myself, coincidentally from the same store. For my Phoenix friends, that would be Tang's Imports. You guys remember Tang's? Yeah, Tang's was awesome. Anyway, an India-made Talwar, or at least Talwar-shaped object, made by the same people I think that made the saber, so it was the same kinds of bad. Mystery steel, no edge, no distal taper. The acid etch stencil on the blade was put on there crooked. The scabbard in this case was covered in some kind of velvet that quickly came apart, and over the top of that was some paper-thin brass fixtures that also split apart, so the scabbard died quickly. However, the grip was a solid piece of brass, so I have to give it that. It was, however, all screwed together with a hex nut on the end of the tang, which allowed me to make, shall we say, a very uneducated, uninformed modification right off the bat. I pulled off the traditional disc pommel because it was uncomfortable and it was in my way. So, yeah. I regretted it a few years later because I was also on a path of studying world religion and philosophy. Yes, I am a student of religion. And part of that, of course, was studying Eastern religions. So I did get to spend some quality time with some Hindus and some Sikhs. And over some really good tea and some really great conversation, we found we had unexpected common ground in our love of classical weapons and martial arts. So they got to show me some of theirs. And boy, was I impressed. And boy, did I regret taking that disc pommel off the Talwar and losing it. And then losing the Talwar. But, you know, since they weren't running a school, I went back to mine. And yeah, we're talking over 40 years ago, to be forgotten. But what did I do with the sword not knowing how to use it? Well, because it was shorter than the cavalry saber, I treated it as a short sword, and at one point actually attempted dual wielding, which makes me glad that there was no video to record it back then. And also, I should probably be grateful that I didn't wind up in the hospital. But nothing bad happened. It was just those things got left behind when I started real martial arts training, right? But now, spoiler alert, because you saw the title of the video, yes, I replaced the Talwar with a cold steel Talwar. And if I was to sum up this review in one sentence, it would be this. I wish I would have bought it sooner. I really do. It's that good, at least for me. Let's talk about why. Let's also talk about sooner than what. Well, I've already done a review of the first saber I've reacquired, trying to, revisit those old memories, and that was a windlass 1860. It's not a bad sword. And then I got, well, the Cold Steel 1796, which I promptly named Market Garden, because I feel like it may be a bridge too far for this old man. Now, it's interesting that the 1860 and this one weigh the same. 2 pounds, 3 ounces, which doesn't sound like a lot. But the 1860 feels blade forward. This one feels like an axe. And a lot of that's point of balance. Point of balance on the 1860 is 5.5 inches. This one's 8.5 inches. So yeah, axe. And I know it's supposed to be, and I'm just being a wimp, but yeah, this has been a struggle. But I'm working on it. Until then, yeah, it's called Market Garden. But let's take a look at these two side by side, shall we? Because there's some unexpected things coming up here. Things that I didn't even expect. Now, I have seen versions of this Talwar, probably early versions of this Talwar, that have this blade on it, which I guess is actually historically accurate because the 1796 was so popular that they did put 1796 blades in Talwar furniture. But here's where things get interesting. This sword weighs more than the other two. Instead of 2 pounds 3 ounces, 2 pounds 6. But it feels like it weighs half as much. Why is that? Well, let's start off with point of balance. 4 inches. And that's measured from the guard. I'm used to measuring point of balance from a habaki on a katana, which would be more like 3 inches, maybe a little under 3 inches, which puts this at the low end of my sweet spot, which means for me this sword feels incredibly light, responsive, maneuverable. Just great, even with one hand. And part of that's the grip. We'll take a look at the grip dynamics here in a second, but I want to focus on the blade for a while. There are a couple of versions of this blade, not only the one with the 1796 version, but a couple like this that are sometimes shown interchangeably in photos on the same ad. And the other version of this has a thin fuller, just north of the spine. This one doesn't. It's a flat triangular blade. It's pretty well done. A little bit Ripley, but that 1796 is really Ripley to the point of being lumpy, to the point that it actually looks like a kid made it by hand out of clay. As I'm reprofiling it, I'm realizing, yeah, it's worse than I thought it was. It's really uneven. This one, not bad. It does have a little bit of a back edge bevel, like it should have a false edge, but it doesn't. However, the edge itself, there's a secondary bevel, but it is nicely sharp. It's made out of 1090 high carbon steel, which is interesting because most other cold steel swords are 1055. So I got a higher carbon blade with this one. But let's talk about performance. I got a break in the weather, and I had a lot of cardboard to kill. So I took advantage and went out and, oh my, this thing made me look good. I turned all those big boxes into delicate little strips with very little effort. Surprising little effort. Now I know Talwars are notorious for being good cutters, but I did not necessarily expect the cold steel reproduction to be this much of a scalpel, especially compared to the 1796, which is just more like an axe. Yeah, great cutter and very easy to handle, very quick, very nimble, very accurate in my hands. And we're talking the first time I'd ever picked it up and took it out. I can only imagine what it's going to be like after I've had some experience with it. Yeah, it's that good for me. So, wow. Cutter, great. Now, like I said, some of that is the hilt, and that was another part of the sword besides the weight, which I shouldn't have been worried about, and the blade shape, which I shouldn't have been worried about. It's a little more curved than the 1860, but less curved than the 1796, which puts it kind of in the range of a Tachi or maybe a Chinese Dao, so not outrageous. Also the blade length. This is another big difference I wasn't really thinking too much about. But those other swords you're talking about, a 31 to 33 inch blade, this one's 29. Now again, I'm measuring that from a guard. So if this was measured like a katana, there'd be a habaki. So now we're talking about a 28 inch blade, which is exactly what I'm used to. So curvature, not bad. Blade length, very familiar. Weight and balance, wonderful. And again, improved by the grip, which I was worried about. Why was I worried about it? Well, the shape. Yeah, not just the disc. Now, I've described my hands as being tiny, and that's mostly my fingers. The width of my hand is a large size glove. So I'm just very disproportionate in my genetics. Don't know how that worked out. Anyway, from the inside of the crossguard to the disc pommel, you're talking pretty much exactly 4 inches. So if you're thinking about getting the sword, take that into account. It is really designed to kind of grip your hand and lock it in. And it does. It really does grip my hand back. And it's not just the disc pommel, but the shape of the guard. First of all, let's take a look at the engraving. Because the engraving on the casting, and this, the handle and the bow, that's one piece. The disc is another piece, and then we'll look at the hex nut on the bottom. That's another piece. The engraving is really good. I was worried it would be too sharp. It's not. Doesn't bite into anything. It's just the right texture. But the detail is really good. The shape of the grip, though, with this traditional bulge in the middle, was unexpected in ways that didn't show up on the photograph. You'll see the ribbing on the sides. So again, it's not overly sharp. But there's no ribbing on the front and back. Those are pretty smooth. Okay? I figure that's just a casting issue. But there's no real massive glaring seams. But the thing that's really unexpected is the profile. It's thinner this way than it is this way. So fatter side to side than it is front to back, like the handle's on there sideways. That sounds like it wouldn't make any sense, but again, it feels really good. It makes the sword actually, I think, even easier for me to handle. So, yeah, all good. Now the disc pommel, it's not as bad as I thought it would be. I have been practicing with a European saber and working on my handshake grip. This made me go back to a full-fisted grip. Okay, I'm kind of used to that. That's not a big deal. So now I'll probably have a little bruise on the side of my hand. When I'm wearing a brace that has knife edge protection, it's not noticeable. If that area of my hand is bare, yeah, it does dig into me a little bit when I'm being sloppy. But again, it's telling me I'm being sloppy. And I just need to learn how to use this right, which is more of in that full-fisted, from the arm sort of cutting. Now, the disc pommel, this is where we get into the great and the bad about this sword, but not for the reason you're probably thinking. The engraving on it, as I zoom in here really good, it's just great. It's better than the hilt. It's really sharp, really deep, really crisp, very well detailed. And the other side ain't bad either, but this is where we get into the glaring issue. Let me see if you can see it. What's wrong with this picture? Yeah. The disc is off-center by about 1/8 of an inch. Now, I thought since this is a screwed construction, threaded, not peened, I figured they just didn't line up everything when they tightened it down, so I did a little tappa with my rubber mallet, and things didn't budge, but they did start to bend, so I'll put a little bit of a dent in the disc I'll have to fix later. So since that wasn't working, I padded a vice grip and grabbed a hold of this fixture here. Is a one-piece nut. So I unscrewed that, and underneath it is another nut, a steel hex nut, and then under that is the disc pommel. And to my chagrin, I discovered that they did not drill the hole in it remotely centered. I mean, I figured they would have some kind of guide or jig or something, right? Yeah, they really missed. So I'm going to have to go in and re-drill that and hope that works. But I wanted to show it to you first before I made any fixes, because this is like the bad thing about the sword's construction. Everything else is tight. I mean, it held up to all that cutting, and the cardboard did not even remotely mar the blade. So, that's good. But crooked pommel, bad. The only other really minor problem I had with the thing is the sword and the scabbard are shipped wrapped separately. So somewhere in there, one of the languettes got bent inward, so I couldn't sheath it until I pried it out, and that took all of like 3 seconds to fix. And now the fit with the scabbard is really good. Now, based on my experience with that early piece of junk Talwar that I bought in the early 70s, I was prepared for what looked like a terrible scabbard, that this would be just stamped sheet brass. It's not. It's a casting. It's solid. And well done. The ring is on there solid, and it's a solid ring. Solid brass chape. Now it's a wooden scabbard covered in leather, and that threw me for a second because I'm thinking dead cow on Hindu sword. But again, the sword itself is made in India, so either they use water buffalo or a cowhide that was appropriately harvested. So I think I don't have any reason to think that's weird. But yeah, I'm just not used to seeing a leather Talwar scabbard. Usually they're fabric or all metal or something. But it's a nice scabbard, and the fit is great. It's very snug. It fits the blade very well. Like I said, it's made out of wood, and like the 1796, inside the mouth of the scabbard, there are a couple of plastic, you probably can't see them, a couple of plastic inserts, these little flaps, and what they do really well is grip the blade for excellent retention without making it hard to draw or resheath. So very smooth, very snug. Great scabbard, fantastic blade. I have to say, like I said, I wish I would have gotten this sooner because I really, really love the sword. It makes me want to learn some things. But yeah, until then I can still use it, you know, at least the ways I know how, and yeah, very successfully. But yeah, you'll probably see me doing more with this and adding it to my conversation. Then I'm planning on the similarities in styles of swordsmanship and techniques for the future. But until then, I hope you found this review interesting, informative, useful information, entertaining. And as usual, I hope to see you again for more.